The gunfire that ripped through the golden hush of a September afternoon in 1878 would take Thomas Whitaker's life within a single day. But it would also deliver his daughter into the arms of the one man who could carry him home to die among the people he loved. And in doing so, it would give Helen Whitaker a love she had never thought to ask for. The road between Cheyenne and the Sweetwater Valley ran flat and dusty under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the wagon whole. Helen sat beside her father on the buckboard, her bonnet pushed back from her face, watching the heat shimmer above the sagebrush. They had sold 60 head of cattle at the railhead for a fair price, better than fair, and Thomas Whitaker had tucked the folded bills deep inside his boot the way he always did, laughing that no bandit alive would think to look there. He was wrong. The men came out of a dry wash so suddenly that the horses reared before Helen even understood what she was seeing. 4 riders, kerchiefs pulled up over their noses, pistols already drawn. The lead rider, a lean man with pale eyes that Helen would never forget, shouted for them to throw down the strongbox. Thomas Whitaker, who had fought at Antietam as a boy of 17, and had never once in his life handed over what belonged to his family without a fight, reached for the shotgun beneath the seat instead. The shot that answered him came from the pale-eyed man's pistol, and it took Thomas high in the side, just beneath his ribs, and knocked him backward off the wagon seat into the dust of the road. Helen screamed his name and threw herself down beside him even as the outlaws, spooked by the sound of an approaching freight wagon somewhere down the trail, wheeled their horses and thundered away in a cloud of dust without the money they had come for. She would learn later that the leader's name was Silas Reed, a man wanted in 2 territories for robbery and worse. But in that moment, she knew nothing except the blood soaking through her father's shirt and the terrible gray color spreading across his face. She got him back onto the wagon somehow, though she never afterward could remember how she found the strength, and she drove the team harder than she had ever driven anything in her life, the wheels bouncing over ruts, her father's head cradled against her knee as she held the reins in white-knuckled fists, praying to a God she was no longer certain was listening. The town of Larkspur Crossing appeared on the horizon like a mercy. It was not much of a place, a scattering of clapboard buildings along a single dusty street, a livery, a mercantile, a saloon with a faded sign, and at the far end, a small house with a shingle that read Dr. Amos Bennett, physician. Helen drove straight for it, shouting for help before the wagon had even fully stopped, and within minutes half the town had gathered to help carry Thomas Whitaker inside. Dr. Bennett was a thin, gray-whiskered man who had seen enough gunshot wounds in his years on the frontier to know within moments what he was looking at. He worked quickly, cutting away Thomas's shirt, probing the wound with careful fingers while Helen stood pressed against the wall of the small examination room, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "The bullet has gone in deep," the doctor said at last, not looking up. "It has torn something inside him that I cannot reach and cannot mend. I am sorry, Miss Whitaker. There is bleeding I cannot stop." "How long?" Helen whispered. Dr. Bennett's eyes were kind and terribly sad. "A few hours, perhaps less. I wish I could tell you otherwise." Thomas Whitaker, lying pale and still on the narrow cot, opened his eyes at the sound of his daughter's voice and found her hand with his own, his grip weaker than she had ever known it to be. "Helen," he said, and his voice was a thread of its old self. "I want to go home." "Papa, you cannot travel, the doctor says." "I did not ask the doctor," Thomas said, and though the words cost him visible effort, there was iron still in them, the same iron that had carried him through a war and through 20 years of building a ranch out of raw prairie. "I want to see your mother. I want to die in my own bed, under my own roof, with the Sweetwater running past my window the way it has every night of my life since I built that house. I do not want to die on a stranger's cot in a town I have visited perhaps 3 times. Helen felt the tears come hot and fast, but she nodded because she understood, because she would have wanted the same thing, because there was nothing in this world more sacred to a Wyoming rancher than the land he had carved his life out of. "The ranch is 25 miles," Dr. Bennett said quietly, drawing Helen aside while an elderly woman from the mercantile sat with Thomas and spoke softly to him of nothing in particular, the way people do for the dying. By wagon, on that road in his condition, it would take 6 hours at the least, and I do not believe his heart would survive the jostling. He needs to travel fast, and yet gently, which is very nearly a contradiction, Miss Whitaker. I do not know how such a thing could be managed." Helen stood in the dusty street outside the doctor's house with the weight of that impossible contradiction pressing down on her chest, and it was there, in the deepening gold light of the afternoon, that she first saw Joseph Townsend. He was leading a horse toward the livery, a horse unlike any Helen had ever seen, a deep bay stallion with a black mane and a chest built like a bellows, standing easily 17 hands, its coat gleaming even beneath a layer of trail dust. The animal moved with a coiled, restless energy, as though even at a walk it resented not running. Helen had grown up around horses her entire life, had judged them at county fairs, had watched her father buy and sell and breed them for 2 decades, and she knew immediately, the way anyone raised on a ranch simply knows, that she was looking at an extraordinary animal. The man leading him was young, perhaps 28, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked cattle and broke horses for a living, with sun-browned skin and dark hair curling out beneath a weathered hat. He noticed her staring and touched his hat brim politely, clearly assuming her interest was simple admiration for a fine horse, which, in a way, it was. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Something I can help you with." Helen did not waste time on pleasantries. Grief and desperation had stripped her down to only the essential truth of things. "Is that horse as fast as he looks?" The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more the shadow of pride a man allows himself about something he has worked hard for. "Fastest horse in 3 territories, ma'am. Won the purse at the Cheyenne Fair 2 years running, and there is not a rancher from here to the Dakota line who has not tried to buy him off me. Name is Whirlwind. I am Joseph Townsend." "Mr. Townsend," Helen said, and her voice broke despite every effort to hold it steady, "my father is dying inside that doctor's house. He wants to go home to die, but home is 25 miles away and no wagon can get him there in time, and no ordinary horse could carry a man in his condition safely at speed. I do not have money enough to buy your horse, and I would not ask you to sell him even if I did. But I am asking you, as one human being to another, to help me carry my father home before he dies." Joseph Townsend stood very still for a long moment, his hand resting on Whirlwind's neck, and something moved behind his eyes that Helen could not name, though she would come to know it well in the months ahead, the particular quiet of a man weighing something enormous against something that mattered even more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "that horse is everything I own of value. I have turned down $400 for him from a man in Miles City. I breed him out to mares 3 counties wide, and it is near half of what keeps my ranch running." Helen's face crumpled, and she began to turn away, ashamed of herself for having asked, for having believed for even a moment that a stranger would give up so much for people he had never met. "But," Joseph Townsend said, and she stopped. He was quiet again, looking past her toward the doctor's house, and when he spoke, his voice had gone low and rough with something that sounded almost like anger, though she would understand later it was not anger at her, but at the unfairness of a world that let good men bleed out on lonely roads while outlaws rode free. "My own father died on a cattle drive when I was 19, he said. Snake bit his horse and threw him, and he broke his back against a rock, and it took him 2 days to die, and there was not a soul who could get him home, because we did not have a horse fast enough and gentle enough at once. I have never forgotten the sound he made asking for his own bed. I will not stand here and watch another man die wanting the same thing when I have the one animal in 3 territories that might make the difference." He turned and led Whirlwind toward the doctor's house without another word, and Helen followed him, her heart pounding with a hope so fierce it frightened her. Inside, Joseph knelt beside Thomas Whitaker's cot and studied the wounded man with a rancher's practical eye, the same eye he would use to judge whether a steer could survive a drive or a horse could survive a race. "Sir," he said, "my name is Joseph Townsend. I have a horse outside faster and smoother gaited than any animal you will find between here and Denver. I propose to rig a sling across my saddle so you may ride cradled against my chest, and I will carry you home myself, riding at whatever pace your body can bear, faster than any wagon and gentler than you might expect. It will not be an easy ride, but I believe we can make it before nightfall if we leave within the hour." Thomas Whitaker's pale eyes found Joseph's face, and something like relief passed over his features, the particular relief of a dying man who has just been handed back a piece of hope he had already surrendered. "You would do this for a stranger," he said, "at the cost of your own horse's health, perhaps his life." "A horse is replaceable, sir," Joseph said quietly. "A father is not." Dr. Bennett protested that the ride would surely kill him faster than waiting, but Thomas Whitaker silenced him with a look that still, even now, carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed on his own land, and said only, "Then I will die faster and happier. Rig the sling, Mr. Townsend, and thank you." They worked quickly. Joseph fashioned a support out of blankets and rope, a kind of cradle across the front of his saddle that would allow Thomas to be carried half reclining, held firmly against Joseph's chest, and one strong arm, his legs supported so the jolting of the ride would fall as much as possible on Joseph's own body rather than the wound. Helen watched him work with an efficiency that spoke of a man who had built and rigged and mended things his whole life, and something in her chest, already raw with grief, opened toward him in a way she did not yet have a name for. The town's blacksmith, a burly man named Otis, offered his own mare for Helen to ride, since her father's wagon horses were spent from the desperate run into town. Dr. Bennett gave her a small bottle of laudanum to ease her father's pain on the journey, along with clean bandages, and instructions she barely heard through the roaring in her own ears. "Whirlwind has never carried two before," Joseph said as he checked the last of the rigging, more to himself than to her. "But he has carried me at full gallop for 12 miles without breaking stride, and he trusts my hands. If any horse alive can do this, it is him." They lifted Thomas Whitaker up together, as gently as 3 grown adults could manage, and settled him into the sling against Joseph's chest. Thomas groaned once sharply, and then set his jaw and said nothing more, the same stoic silence Helen had watched him carry through every hardship of her childhood, through droughts and blizzards and the loss of 2 infant sons before Helen was born. "Ready, sir?" Joseph asked quietly. "Ready," Thomas whispered. "Take me home to my wife, Mr. Townsend." They rode out of Larkspur Crossing as the sun tipped westward, Joseph Townsend at a controlled canter with the dying man cradled against him, Helen close beside on the borrowed mare, and behind them the small crowd of townsfolk who had gathered to watch stood silent, hats in hand, the way people do when they have witnessed something they will speak of for years. The first miles passed across open, gently rolling grassland, and Whirlwind moved beneath his double burden with a smoothness that seemed almost impossible for an animal carrying so much weight at such speed, his stride long and even, his breathing steady. Joseph rode with his whole body angled to absorb the shock of the ground, taking the jolts into his own spine and shoulders so that Thomas Whitaker was jostled as little as a man in his condition could be. Helen rode at his flank, watching her father's face for any sign that the journey was killing him faster than the wound itself. But though his color remained gray and his breathing shallow, he did not cry out, and once, when they slowed briefly to let the horses breathe at a shallow crossing of Willow Creek, he even managed a faint ghost of a smile. "He rides like he was born in a saddle," Thomas murmured, meaning Joseph, and Helen, glancing at the young man's set jaw and steady hands, found she could not disagree. "You are doing well, sir," Joseph said, adjusting the blanket beneath Thomas's shoulder. "We have covered nearly 8 miles already, 17 more to go." "You are risking that horse's legs on this ground," Thomas said. "I have bred and raced horses 40 years. I know what a hard ride at speed over broken ground can do to tendons." "I know it too," Joseph said simply. "I decided that was a fair trade before I ever saddled him." They pressed on. The land began to change as they climbed gradually toward the Sweetwater Valley, the grass giving way in patches to sage and broken rock, the trail narrowing where it wound along a bluff above a dry ravine. It was here, with perhaps 12 miles remaining, that Helen's borrowed mare threw a shoe on a stretch of loose shale and stumbled badly enough that Helen was thrown, landing hard in the dust and scrub, the breath knocked from her lungs. Joseph reined Whirlwind up sharply, torn between the dying man in his arms and the woman lying motionless on the ground, and for one terrible heartbeat neither of them moved. "I am well," Helen gasped, pushing herself upright, though pain shot through her wrist where she had caught herself. "I am well, go on, do not stop for me, my father cannot afford the delay." "I will not leave you injured on open ground with outlaws somewhere behind us," Joseph said, his voice sharp with a fear that surprised them both. "Can you stand? Can you ride?" Helen forced herself to her feet, cradling her wrist, and nodded, though her face was white with pain. "I can ride. The mare is lame, though. She cannot carry me farther at any pace." Joseph looked from the injured mare to his own horse, already carrying more than any animal should reasonably be asked to bear, and made a decision that Helen would remember for the rest of her life as the moment she understood exactly what kind of man he was. "Then you will ride with us," he said. "Whirlwind can carry 3 if he must, for the remaining distance if we go slower and careful. Your father's life matters more than speed for these last miles, and I will not leave his daughter injured on a mountain trail with your father's murderers possibly still hunting this road." He helped her up behind him, her injured wrist held awkwardly against his back, her good arm wrapped around his waist for balance, and in that strange and desperate closeness, pressed together on the back of the extraordinary horse with her dying father cradled in front of them both, Helen felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with grief. They went on at a walk for a mile until the trail widened again, and then Joseph coaxed Whirlwind back into a careful, rolling canter, the great horse straining now under the weight of 3, his breathing louder, sweat darkening his neck and flanks, but never once faltering, never once slowing more than Joseph asked of him. The sun was low and red over the western ridges when they finally crested the last hill above the Sweetwater Valley, and Helen, looking past Joseph's shoulder, saw the ranch house appear below them, smoke curling from its chimney, and standing in the yard, drawn outside perhaps by some instinct only mothers possess, was Sarah Whitaker, already running toward the sound of hooves. "Papa," Helen whispered, tears streaking clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "We made it. We made it home." Thomas Whitaker's eyes, which had drifted closed somewhere in the last mile, opened once more, and he found enough strength to say, "Sarah," before his voice failed entirely. Joseph brought Whirlwind down the final slope at a careful walk, the great horse trembling now with exhaustion but still, even in his depletion, moving with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate, as though he understood the fragility of the cargo he carried. Sarah Whitaker reached them before they had even stopped, her hands going immediately to her husband's face, calling his name, and between them, Joseph and Helen lifted Thomas Whitaker down and carried him inside to the bed he had built with his own hands 22 years before. He lived through the night. It was, Dr. Bennett would say later when he arrived the following morning, having ridden out at first light, more than he had expected, and he credited it entirely to the peace of dying in familiar surroundings, in his own bed, beside the woman he had loved for 30 years, rather than the shock and terror of a hospital cot in a strange town. Thomas Whitaker died just before dawn, with Sarah's hand in his and Helen kneeling at his other side, and his last words, spoken so softly that Helen had to lean close to hear them, were words of gratitude, not fear. "Tell that young man," he whispered, "that he gave an old rancher his dying wish. Tell him I will not forget it wherever I am going." Helen promised that she would, and held her father's hand until it grew still and cold. And outside in the gray light of morning, Joseph Townsend stood alone in the yard beside his exhausted horse, giving the grieving family the privacy they needed. His own eyes wet with tears he did not try to hide, mourning a man he had known for less than a single day, but had come in that day to respect more than he could easily explain. When Helen finally came out to him, her eyes swollen and red, she found him kneeling beside Whirlwind, running his hand slowly down the horse's foreleg, his expression troubled. "Is he hurt?" Helen asked. Joseph did not look up immediately. "The tendon in his near foreleg is hot and swollen. I suspect I have strained it badly, perhaps torn it, carrying 3 of us those last miles at speed over that broken ground. He may never run fast again, not the way he used to." He straightened, and there was something raw and unguarded in his face when he finally met her eyes. "But I would do it again tonight without a moment's hesitation, and I am sorry for your loss, Miss Whitaker. Your father was a fine man. I am only glad I could give him what he asked for." Helen felt something break open in her chest. Grief and gratitude tangled together so tightly she could not separate them, and before she quite knew what she was doing, she had crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around Joseph Townsend, weeping against his dusty shoulder while he held her, awkward and gentle, one hand resting against her hair. "You gave up everything for a man you had never met," she said into his shirt. "You gave up your horse's legs, his racing, everything you told me he was worth to you. Why would you do such a thing for strangers?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment before he answered, his voice rough. "Because somewhere out there is a man who watched my own father die on the trail without anyone able to carry him home, and I have spent 9 years wishing someone had done for us what I was able to do for you. I could not have lived with myself if I had kept that horse fresh and fast, and let your father die on a stranger's cot instead." They stood together in the pale morning light for a long while, the grief of the night settling around them like the dust that had not yet cleared from the yard, and neither of them spoke of it then. But something had already begun between them that neither grief nor time would be able to undo. The days that followed were heavy with the business of death, the digging of a grave on the hillside overlooking the ranch where Thomas Whitaker had asked to be buried years before, the arrival of neighbors from the scattered ranches along the valley bringing food and quiet condolences, the small funeral service conducted by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Larkspur crossing that same week. Joseph Townsend stayed through it all, though no one had asked him to, tending to Whirlwind's injured leg with cold compresses and patient care, and quietly taking on the chores that a ranch does not stop needing simply because its master has died, mending a broken fence rail, driving the cattle down from the upper pasture before an early frost, splitting wood for the widow's stove. Sarah Whitaker, though buried in her own grief, was not blind to what was happening beneath her roof, and one evening, some 10 days after her husband's death, she found Helen sitting on the porch steps watching Joseph work with a rope halter on a young colt in the corral, and she sat down beside her daughter with the particular knowing quiet of a mother who has seen enough of life to recognize its patterns. "He has no reason to stay any longer," Sarah said. "The fences are mended, the cattle are down from the high pasture, and his own ranch has surely gone untended these 2 weeks. "I know," Helen said. "Do you want him to stay?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, watching the easy, patient way Joseph moved with the frightened colt, his voice low and steady, his hands never rushing. "I do not know what I want, Mama. I only know that when he is not here the house feels emptier than it did even the day after we buried Papa." Sarah Whitaker smiled, faint and sad and knowing, and reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Your father liked him a great deal in the short hours he knew him. He said as much to me that first night, before he went. Perhaps that is a kind of blessing, given how few hours your father had left to give. That evening, when Joseph came in from the corral, weary and dust-streaked, Helen brought him coffee on the porch and sat beside him as the sun went down gold and orange over the western ridges, painting the whole valley in the color of a promise. "You should go home, Mr. Townsend," she said, though it cost her something to say it. "Your own place has surely suffered from your absence, and we have imposed on your kindness longer than any family has a right to." Joseph looked at her sideways, and there was something careful and searching in his expression. "Is that what you want, for me to go?" "I asked what you should do," Helen said, "not what I want." "Those are not the same question," Joseph agreed, "and I notice you have not answered either of them plainly." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I will tell you plainly, then, since you seem disinclined to. I do not want to go, Miss Whitaker. I have not wanted to leave since the morning I stood in your yard and watched you weep for your father, and every day since has only made the wanting worse, not better. But I did not come here looking to court a grieving woman while her father's grave is still fresh on the hillside, and I would not have you think I stayed these 2 weeks with anything but honest kindness in my heart." "I know that," Helen said softly. "I have never doubted it, not for one moment since you led that horse out of the livery and asked if there was something you could help me with." They sat together as the light faded and the first stars appeared over the valley, and though neither of them said anything more of consequence that evening, something had been settled between them all the same, an understanding that did not require the urgency of words to be real. Joseph did return to his own ranch 3 days later, a modest spread some 15 miles to the south that he ran with the help of one hired hand, an older cowboy named Ezra who had worked cattle since before the war, and asked no questions about where his employer had disappeared to for 2 weeks beyond a raised eyebrow and a grunt of understanding once Joseph explained. Whirlwind's leg healed slowly over the following weeks, the swelling receding, though Joseph confided to Helen, on one of the many visits he began to make to the Whitaker ranch under the thin pretense of checking on Sarah's welfare, that the horse would likely never race again at his old speed. "Does that grieve you?" Helen asked him one such afternoon, as they walked together along the fence line while Sarah dozed in a chair on the porch, worn thin by grief and the slow work of healing. "It grieved me for about a week," Joseph admitted. "I had dreamed of racing him at the territorial fair again next summer, perhaps even taking him east to race against horses from Kentucky and Virginia. Men said he was fast enough. But then I remember the sound your father made when we brought him over that last hill, and he saw his own house waiting for him, and I find I cannot grieve a horse's legs when I think of what those legs bought him instead." Helen stopped walking and looked at him for a long moment, the autumn wind moving through the tall grass around them, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had never in her life met a man who measured the worth of things so differently from everyone else she had known. "My father asked me to tell you something," she said. "Before he died, he said to tell you that you gave an old rancher his dying wish, and that he would not forget it wherever he was going." Joseph's eyes glistened, and he looked away toward the ridge line for a moment before he trusted himself to speak. "I have carried that thought with me every day since, Miss Whitaker. I do not think there is a finer thing a man could hear said of him." It was around this time, as autumn deepened into the first hard frosts of October, that trouble found its way back into the valley in the form of Silas Reed and the remnants of his gang, who had been laying low in the Badlands to the north since the botched robbery that had cost Thomas Whitaker his life, and who had grown desperate enough for money to risk returning to the Sweetwater country, where lawmen might still remember their faces. Word reached Larkspur Crossing first, carried by a drifter who had seen 4 riders matching the gang's description watering their horses at a spring 2 days' ride to the north, and Sheriff Cole Hutchins, a broad, deliberate man who had worn the badge in that country for 6 years, rode out personally to warn the ranches scattered along the valley, the Whitaker place among them, that the men responsible for Thomas Whitaker's death might be riding this way again, likely hunting easy targets among the isolated homesteads before winter closed the passes. Joseph was at the Whitaker ranch when Sheriff Hutchins delivered his warning, having ridden over that morning ostensibly to look at a fence line, but in truth simply to see Helen, and he listened to the sheriff's account with a stillness that Helen had come to recognize as the particular quiet Joseph wore when something mattered enormously to him. "I will not have Mrs. Whitaker and her daughter left alone and undefended on this ranch," Joseph said, once the sheriff had ridden on to warn the neighboring spreads. "Not with those men possibly in the valley." "We have managed alone before," Helen said, though there was less certainty in her voice than she intended. "Your father is not here to manage it with you now," Joseph said gently, "and I do not intend to sit 15 miles away worrying whether the men who killed him have come back to finish whatever business brought them to this road in the first place. I am staying, Helen, until this is settled, and I do not much care what anyone in Larkspur Crossing has to say about the propriety of it." It was the first time he had used her given name, and Helen felt the sound of it settle into her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that she suspected would never entirely fade. He stayed, sleeping in the small bunkhouse near the barn that had once housed the ranch's hired hands before hard years had thinned the Whitaker operation down to just the family. And for 11 tense days the ranch waited, rifles kept loaded by the door, lanterns doused early to avoid drawing attention across the dark plain. The trouble came on a moonless night in late October, when the sound of hooves in the yard woke the household well past midnight. Joseph was up and moving before the first shout came, rifle in hand, and found 4 riders in the yard, Silas Reed unmistakable among them even in darkness, his pale eyes catching what little light there was like a wolf's. "We are only after what is owed us," Reed called out, his voice carrying the false, careless confidence of a man used to frightening people into compliance. "The old man's strongbox, and we will trouble you no further." "The old man is dead," Joseph called back from the shadow of the porch, his rifle steady against his shoulder, "on account of the last time you and your men came calling. There is nothing here for you but trouble, Reed, and I would advise you to ride on before you find more of it than you bargained for." What followed was brief and frightening rather than prolonged, a scattering of gunfire in the dark, the flash and crack of it lighting the yard in strobes, Helen firing from an upstairs window with her father's own rifle, while Sarah kept low behind the heavy oak table dragged in front of the door. It was Joseph's shot, steady and true from years of hunting his own meat on the range, that caught Silas Reed high in the shoulder and sent him reeling from his saddle with a cry of pain and fury. And it was the sight of their leader down that finally broke the resolve of the other 3 riders, who wheeled their horses and fled into the darkness, leaving Reed cursing in the dirt of the yard. Sheriff Hutchins arrived with 2 deputies before dawn, summoned by a rider Joseph had sent at the first sound of hooves, and took the wounded Silas Reed into custody, along with the confession that spilled out of him under the weight of blood loss and fear, a confession that would eventually see him and the remnants of his gang tried, and sentenced in the territorial court at Cheyenne for the robbery and killing that had begun this entire story. In the gray light of that morning, with the danger past and the yard finally quiet, Helen found Joseph sitting on the porch steps, his hands still trembling slightly with the aftermath of violence, and she sat down beside him without a word, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that needed no explanation between them. "You could have been killed," she said finally. "So could you," Joseph said. "I have never in my life been so afraid as I was tonight, watching those men ride into this yard, thinking of what might happen to you and your mother." "Why does it frighten you so much?" Helen asked, though she already suspected the answer. "What happens to us?" Joseph turned to look at her, and in the pale light of the coming dawn, his face held nothing guarded or careful anymore. "Because I love you, Helen Whitaker. I believe I have loved you since the moment you asked me if that horse was as fast as he looked, and I have been too much of a coward these past weeks to say so plainly, telling myself it was too soon, that your grief needed room to breathe before I filled it with anything of my own. But I find I cannot pretend any longer, not after tonight, not after nearly losing the chance to ever say it at all. Helen felt the tears come, but they were warm this time, not the cold grief of the weeks before, and she reached up to touch his face, rough with 2 days of stubble, and said, I have loved you since you rode into this valley with my father cradled against your chest, giving up everything you owned of value to grant a dying man his last wish. I did not think it possible to love someone that quickly, but I have had a great deal of time since to be certain of it. Joseph Townsend. He kissed her then, there on the porch steps in the gray light of a dangerous night finally ended, gently and then not so gently, and Sarah Whitaker, watching from the kitchen window with a coffee pot in her hand and tears of her own gathering, decided it was not yet time to interrupt them, and went back to making breakfast for the small, tired, and finally hopeful household. The winter that followed was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, deep snow closing the passes and driving temperatures far below anything that made travel comfortable. But it was also, for Helen Whitaker, the happiest season of her adult life. Joseph came whenever the weather allowed, sometimes staying for days at a time when storms made the ride back to his own ranch too dangerous. And Sarah, far from objecting to the closeness growing between the two young people beneath her roof, seemed to find in it a kind of comfort against her own grief, as though her husband's dying wish had somehow bought her daughter a happiness that eased the weight of her own loss. Whirlwind's leg healed enough over the winter months that by spring he could be ridden again at a comfortable walk and trot, though Joseph never again asked him for the hard, flat gallops that had once made him famous across 3 territories. And there was talk in Larkspur Crossing that spring of the great horses racing days being finished, talk that Joseph never once contradicted or seemed to regret. He earned his rest, Joseph told Helen one warm April morning, as they walked together through the pasture where Whirlwind now grazed alongside 2 mares Joseph had brought over from his own ranch, part of a slow, deliberate process of merging the 2 small operations into one larger concern, a process that made practical sense even before either of them had spoken the word marriage aloud between them. There is no shame in a horse who gave everything he had once, when it mattered most. I would rather have that than a dozen races won afterward. It was in May, with the wildflowers coming up thick and purple across the Sweetwater Valley, and the grass turning green again after the long winter, that Joseph Townsend asked Helen Whitaker to marry him, kneeling in that same pasture beside the horse who had carried them both, along with her dying father, across 25 miles of hard country on the worst night of her life. I do not have very much to offer you, he said, holding a small ring that had belonged to his own mother, the one thing of value he had kept from his family besides the horse he had already given up so much for. A modest ranch, a herd of cattle not yet large enough to make either of us wealthy, and a horse who will never race again. But I can offer you a lifetime of exactly the kind of love that carried your father home to die among the people who loved him, Helen. I will spend every day of that lifetime making certain you never doubt it. You already gave me everything that mattered, Helen said, kneeling down in the grass in front of him so their eyes were level, tears streaking down her face even as she laughed with the joy of it. The moment you led that horse out of the livery and asked if there was something you could help me with. Yes, Joseph. Yes, I will marry you. They were married in June, in the small church at Larkspur Crossing, with Sarah Whitaker weeping happy tears in the front pew and Dr. Bennett and Sheriff Hutchins, and half the town gathered to celebrate a match that had, in its way, become something of a local legend already. The story of the fastest horse in 3 territories carrying a dying man home, and the love that had grown out of that single desperate ride. Ezra, Joseph's hired hand, stood as his witness, gruffly wiping his eyes when the vows were spoken, and old Otis the blacksmith, whose mare had thrown a shoe on that terrible ride and thereby, in a strange way, sealed the closeness between Helen and Joseph on the back of Whirlwind, presented them with a hand-forged set of horseshoes as a wedding gift, joking that they were lucky ones, tested already by the hardest ride any horse in the territory had ever made. They combined the two ranches that summer, running cattle together across land that stretched from the Whitaker homestead south toward Joseph's original spread. And Sarah Whitaker, rather than being displaced by her daughter's marriage, found her own life fuller for it, a grandmother's joy waiting for her within the year when Helen gave birth, in the spring of 1880, to a healthy son they named Thomas, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose dying wish had, in its own roundabout way, given him his very existence. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah after her grandmother, and Sarah Whitaker, holding her granddaughter for the first time on the same porch where Helen had once wept in Joseph's arms in the gray light after a dangerous night, wept again, but this time with a happiness so complete it felt, she said, like her husband's spirit had come back around full circle to bless the family he had loved. Whirlwind lived out his days in comfortable retirement on the combined ranch, growing sway-backed and gray around the muzzle as the years passed. But Joseph never sold him, never bred him beyond a handful of foals sired in his prime years before the injury. And one of those foals, a bay colt with his father's same restless energy, was given, at young Thomas Townsend's insistence when he was old enough to choose, the very same name his father had once carried. On summer evenings, when the work of the ranch was done and the light stretched long and gold across the Sweetwater Valley, Joseph and Helen would sometimes walk together out to the hillside where Thomas Whitaker was buried, their children running ahead of them through the grass, and stand for a while in the quiet, remembering the man whose dying wish had, in ways none of them could have predicted on that terrible September afternoon, given all of them the family they now had. He would have loved this, Helen said once, watching young Thomas chase his little sister around their grandfather's headstone, laughing in the way children laugh when the world has not yet taught them grief. All of it, you, the children, the way the ranch has grown. I like to think he already knows, Joseph said, taking her hand in his, the same steady hand that had once held a dying man cradled against his chest for 25 miles of hard riding, and now held his wife's hand with the same unshakable steadiness. I like to think that wherever he is, he remembers that a stranger once gave up the fastest horse in 3 territories to carry him home, and that the stranger got a good deal more out of the bargain than he ever expected. Helen laughed through sudden tears, leaning into him as the sun sank low and gold over the ridges of the valley that had become, through loss and courage, and a love neither of them had seen coming, entirely and completely home. They stood together like that for a long while, husband and wife, their children's laughter carrying on the warm evening air, the horse who had started it all grazing peacefully in the near pasture, and behind them, the ranch house glowing with lamplight against the coming dark, full of every good thing that had grown, against all expectation, out of the worst day of Helen Whitaker's life. It was, Helen often thought in the quiet years that followed, exactly the kind of ending her father would have wanted for her, not because it erased the grief of losing him, but because it proved, in the deepest way a life can prove anything, that even in the darkest hour on a lonesome Wyoming road, there could still be found a man willing to give up everything he had, so that love, in its many unexpected forms, might have the chance to follow him home.